Li Bai, A Song of Changgan. When my hair first covered my forehead, I picked flowers and played with them by my gate. You came, riding on a bamboo horse, and played with plums around the railing of the well. We both lived in Changgan village, two children with no suspicion of each other. At 14, I became your wife. I was shy and had not yet smiled at you. I lowered my head toward the shaded wall. You called 1,000 times, but I never answered. At 15, I began to smile and hoped we would be together, even as dust or ashes. I believed we would never be apart, so why would I even need to climb the lookout tower? When I was 16, you went on a long journey through Chutang Gorge with its Yanyu rocks, sharp beneath the high water of the 5 month, where the sad cries of the apes filled the skies. By the front gate your footprints are still there, but one by one they fill with moss. Moss so deep now I can't sweep it away, as leaves fall early in autumn winds. In the 8th month butterflies have come. Pairs of them flutter in our western garden. Seeing these things makes my heart sad. I sit, mourning the loss of my youthful beauty. When at last you set out from the 3 gorges, send a letter ahead to let me know. I will come to meet you, no matter how far, even all the way to Long Wind Sands. Okay, so we have here yet another ballad by Li Bai, and this is a very interesting one because I think it recreates very effectively the tone of the original ballads from the Han Dynasty. So this is a literary reworking of a traditional theme by Li Bai, but I think more than in some of the previous ballad poems we've encountered in this anthology, this one really retains a lot of the elements of the original poetry. So first a comment on the title. The title can be misleading. So, A Song of Changgan, this is not the imperial capital Changgan. As the poem says, this is a village. From what I have just searched, it was a small village in the Jiangsu River Valley, so in the south of China, very near what would later become the city of Nanjing. And this is a typical Juefu ballad. It has many elements of the balladic genre. So, for example, its narrativeness. It tells a story, and this is very typical of ballads. Its repetitions. So it follows a very repetitive structure with, at this age, such and such, at this age, such and such, at this age, such and such. Also, the topic is relatively poignant, but it's also relatively conventional. So we'll talk about that when we talk about the themes of the poem. But this is basically marriage and longing for the departed husband, which is, as I say, a very, very typical topic of Chinese poetry, almost since the beginning of the tradition, and especially strong since the late Han in, for example, the 19 old poems. And it's pretty, the language is pretty straightforward, I believe, as well. I mean, there aren't many clear, at least, literary references or intertextualities. It's a pretty straightforward story. So all of these are elements of the ballad genre. So as we said, what is the topic of the poem? The poem is narrated in a female persona of a married wife, and the woman begins explaining her life with her husband before they were husbands. She starts in childhood when they first met. They get married very early through an arranged marriage. At the beginning, she's not too happy about it, but afterwards she starts falling in love or developing an affection for her husband. But just then her husband has to go away. It's not specified really in the poem why he is going away. It could be war, it could be business, but he has to go away and travel up the Jiangsu River Valley. And she misses him. She's at home. Time passes. It's not really clear how much time passes. My impression from this poem is that a year has passed. Other translators have considered that many more years have passed. So remember that Chinese is very ambiguous, sometimes as related to the subject of the poem, to the time an event takes place, to the person or persons who's speaking. So that's not too clear. But clearly the poem ends on a very poignant note, on a slightly melancholy note. The woman is longing for the return of her husband, so much so that she offers to go to the ends of the world, to the long wind sands, which in this time was, I think, a region in the extreme west or northwest of China. So she's really willing, as soon as she gets any piece of news from him of going to the end of the world, to join again with her husband. And there is a sadness at the loss of beauty because of not being with her, of getting older and not being in the company of her beloved. So, as I say, typical Juefu poem, or quite typical. Let's follow it bit by bit. I would say we could divide the poem into two parts. Okay, the first part would be the whole story of the meeting of the husband and wife from their youth until their separation. And the second part would be the remaining part, one from 16 years old onwards, when they have to separate. And that second part focuses on the loneliness and on the suffering of the wife at the absence of her husband. So let's begin with the first part. And the first part could also be subdivided because, it has different sections for different ages into at least three parts. So first part, which would be the first three couplets approximately. When my hair first covered my forehead, I picked flowers and played with them by my gate. So when she's a child, she's still a child. Her hair first covers her forehead, so she's no longer a baby. She's a very young child. So she's playing in the village. She's picking flowers and playing with them outside her house. And then at this very, very remote in time, at this very early period, you came riding on a bamboo horse and played with plums round the railing of the well. We both lived in Changgan village, two children with no suspicion of each other. So the first part of the poem, these three couplets, paint for us a picture of youthful, childish innocence. The two people here, the man and the woman, are still not a man and a woman. They are a pair of children, very young, and the poem shows them in the village playing childish games as befits their age. So the boy is riding a bamboo horse and playing with plums, and the girl is picking flowers. So they're children with the innocence and with the innocent activities of children. So now the second part. At 14, I became your wife. I was shy and had not yet smiled at you. I lowered my head toward the shaded wall. You called 1,000 times, but I never answered. So they get married at 14, which would be, from our perspective, a shockingly young age. But we must remember that people in the past, not only in China, but also in Europe, got married much, much, much earlier than we did. Probably for women after the first menstruation, they were considered in the marrying age. And in China, marriages were basically arranged. So families negotiated the marriage. Individuals, most of the time, had very little to say about the issue. And in this section, the woman, the girl, doesn't seem to be too happy about getting married. Perhaps she's just showing the modesty that is expected of a young Chinese woman in traditional Chinese culture. But anyway, she's not too happy. She doesn't seem too happy about the situation. Yeah, she never smiles. She avoids her husband. She doesn't answer his calls. The thing changes the next year. So I imagine we should probably interpret these years, maybe not strictly as year after year, but as references to more or less fixed periods of time. Later on, at 15, she does start to feel affection for her husband. Yeah? At 15, I first began to smile. and hoped we would be together, even as dust or ashes. I believed we would never be apart. So why would I ever need to climb the lookout tower? So finally, at 15, she starts developing feelings for her husband. She conventionally wishes to be forever with him, close as dust or ashes. Yeah? And she can't imagine what is going to happen. She cannot envisage that separation is just around the corner. So she doesn't do the things that people do when they prepare for separation. So with this finishes the first part of the poem, which is, you could say, it's a long introduction, creating a background for what is to come. It's a good introduction because, we see the evolution of how a girl is growing, how she gets into a marriage, not too willingly, but how she ends up developing affection for her husband just to have the situation, the tables turned, not because she ceases to have affection for her husband, but because she is forced to separate from him just when she was starting to love him. So now, when I was 16, the second part, you went on a long journey through Chutang Gorge with its Yanju rocks, sharp beneath the high water of the 5th month, when the sad cries of the apes fill the skies. So now at 16, he has to go. Again, as I said before, we get no indication about why he has to go. There's no indication of war, so it's probably not war. Maybe it's business. Maybe he's a merchant. After all, Changgan was, I think it was an important key in the Yangtze River Valley, so probably he's a merchant. That is how another translator of this poem, Ezra Pound, has interpreted it. And he goes up the Yangtze River Valley, the Chutang Gorge. It's an area with big rocks, the Yanju rocks, which in the summer, after the rains, can become dangerous because the waters cover the rocks. And the gorges are also, side by side, accompanied by high elevations. And that's when you can hear apes and gibbons crying at night, which is a conventional oral image of Chinese imagery, especially for forests and wild areas. So he has gone. What happens at home? By the front gate, your footprints are still there, but one by one they fill with moss. Moss so deep now I can't sweep it away, as leaves fall early in autumn winds. So the season has passed on. From summer we're in autumn, but probably more than a few months have passed, perhaps a year. Our female protagonist finds herself in the autumn season and her husband is away. Remember, autumn in traditional Chinese poetry is a season of sadness, and all the elements pile up to intensify this cosmic melancholy of the season with the very subjective and particular sadness of the wife whose husband is absent. His footprints, as we say, are filled with moss. They have been covered. And the moss is now so thick because time has passed that, it can't be taken away from the footprints. And also the leaves are falling and the winds are blowing, which are typical sights and sounds of autumn. In the 8th month, butterflies have come. Pairs of them flutter in our western garden. That's yet another image. The butterflies coming and fluttering, a symbol of beauty, but also a symbol here of absence, because the butterflies are together, whereas the man and the woman are separated. So after seeing these natural signs of the season, we get a more direct, a more explicit show of the feelings of the wife. Seeing these things makes my heart sad. I sit, mourning the loss of my youthful beauty. So I feel sad at the oncoming old age, which comes along with the separation from my beloved. So I'm growing old and we're living apart, which is again a very common theme, a very common topic, at least present in the 19 old poems. The idea that having to part husband and wife is terrible, and her youth, her best moments will be lost while the husband is away doing his duty. And finally, the poem concludes with a direct call, a direct imprecation from the woman to her husband, as if she could speak to him or as if she could send him a message. When at last you set out from the 3 gorges, send a letter ahead to let me know. I will come to meet you, no matter how far, even all the way to the long wind sands. Now, we have to assume that these people were probably literate, even though so that would restrict the popular element of the protagonists of the poem. In many ballads, we have letters being interchanged between husband and wife, and some of those letters are established that there is no possible return, but there's always hope. Yeah? So the poetic persona of the woman is saying, I will wait for you, I will go out for you, I really miss you. Now, this poem has been very successfully and very frequently translated. It's a very popular poem. Li Bai is a very popular poet in the West, and this poem is one of the ones that usually gets translated. We're not going to comment on the other translations. I just checked a few of them. Probably the most famous one is by Ezra Pound. If you search the internet, you can find it. It's the River Merchant's Wife, a Letter. So in that poem, it's all represented as a letter. Yeah, I've just read it. Not bad. Very Poundish. Very in the style of Pound. Other translations, there's a more classical one by Arthur Waley with the title Changgan. And there's, just to mention a third one, which you can find in the internet as well, by David Hinton. This is a relatively recent one, Changgan Village Song. And, well, there are stylistic differences between all of those. Pounds is a very good poem as a poem, but it's probably taking a lot of freedom with the original text. Waley is generally more he knew Chinese, so he's more loyal to the original spirit and language of the poem. Hinton, for example, includes an innovation, which is in his poem there is a greater sense of a long passage of time between the separation of the lovers and the present, which, in the version I have just read, and in Pounds, it's no more than a year, but in Hinton, it's a longer time. But altogether, quite a nice ballad, quite a nice poem.